Hey, sister students. Today we're talking about the domestic policies of the 1970s. All right, the first president we're going to talk about during the 1970s is President Nixon. He is a Republican, and he was elected in the 1968 election. LBJ decided not to run for president in 1968, mainly due to concerns over the Vietnam War. Okay, we need to talk about two pieces of legislation that were important when dealing with the environment during the 1970s. The first is the Endangered Species Act, which identified species that were being threatened with extinction, put them on a list in order to try to save them from extinction. The second one is the creation of the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency. The goal here is to try to cut down on pollution, air pollution, water pollution, and this group set standards and enforces those standards by companies and citizens within the United States. So they're trying to cut down on environmental issues, and this was all started during Nixon's administration. Okay, one of the major things that was being discussed during the 1970s was, should there be an amendment added to the Constitution that gives women equal rights under the law? And so an amendment was proposed. It was dubbed the Equal Rights Amendment. And it had actually been proposed every session of Congress since 1923, but had failed to get through Congress until 1972. It passed and was then sent to the states. That's how this process works. So if Congress passes an amendment to the Constitution, 3/4 of the states have to ratify it in order for it to go into effect. So obviously there were people that wanted to put equal rights for women into the Constitution, but there were also those that did not want to, and many of them were also women. One such woman, her name was Phyllis Schlafly, and she was a critic of the ERA. She did not want the ERA to become part of the Constitution. She campaigned against it. She believed that it would harm family life, that women's roles would change, and that women would have to register for the draft and be drafted into military combat. And this was one of the biggest arguments against it, and one of the main reasons why it ultimately failed and why the Equal Rights Amendment was never passed. So we still to this day do not have equal rights for women written into the Constitution. Okay, notice here's two women that are against the ERA. They're wearing buttons on their shirt that says, "All that is between me and the draft is the ERA." So they are kind of pushing this idea that if you give women equal rights as men, then they will have to do all the same things as men, including military combat and anything else. Another argument that was made would be that men and women would have to share bathrooms, because if you make everyone equal, then why would you have separate bathrooms? So there were many arguments against it. Obviously, there's many arguments for it, but it did not pass. Okay, next issue that the Nixon administration is going to face is something dealing with this guy right here. His name is Spiro Agnew. He was Nixon's vice president. And in 1973, he resigned. He resigned his office as vice president because it came to light that he had taken bribes and had evaded paying income taxes in the state of Maryland. And so the next step for Nixon, based on the layout in the Constitution, the 25th Amendment, states that Nixon appoint a new vice president. And he appointed a man named Gerald Ford, a congressman from Michigan, to become the new vice president of the United States. The biggest issue that Nixon faced is something called Watergate, the Watergate scandal. It all started in 1972, where burglars were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters located in the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. Now, these burglars, they were arrested for breaking in, trying to wiretap the Democratic headquarters. they were connected back to a committee to reelect the president, part of Nixon's reelection campaign, because in 1972 there was an election happening, and this was in summer of 1972. That fall, there would be the election. Nixon is elected in 1972, and he denies that he had anything to do with these guys and the break-in and anything else. To make a long story short, what ultimately happens is several years later, after probing and investigations, it's finally uncovered that Nixon had been involved to cover up the crime. Now, they were never able to prove that he ordered the crime, but they were able to prove that he covered up the crime. And so when this involvement came to light, he resigned as president of the United States. Now, key factor, it's on a star here. Nixon was never impeached. He resigned before he could be impeached. And an impact of the Watergate scandal is that people are going to mistrust their leaders. It's going to cause a schism between the government and the people. So back to Gerald Ford. Remember, Ford was not elected as vice president. He was chosen by Nixon to be vice president. And now he's president, and he was not elected to be president. So this is the only person in history who has become president without being elected as either president or vice president. So he goes ahead and he says, the country needs to move on. We need to pardon Nixon of any crimes he may have committed. The last thing we need is to have our past president drug through a trial and this whole public split. And so he goes ahead and he pardons him. And that kind of hurts his credibility a little bit. A lot of people are very angry at Ford for this pardon, and it kind of hurts his presidency going forward. Economic issues in the 1970s. So the 70s is a time of not a great economy. The economy is suffering through something called stagflation. Now, stagflation is a combination of high unemployment combined with high inflation. So inflation means prices are going up and employment is going down. So this is not good. So unemployment is up, people don't have jobs, and prices are going up. So this is a double whammy. One thing that's also hurting the American economy during this time period is oil prices. There's a group called OPEC, stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Companies, and they are a group of countries that control most of the world's oil reserves. And they impose an oil embargo, which means they aren't going to sell it to the United States, due to our support for the country of Israel. And so when they stop selling to the U.S., there is shortages of gasoline and oil, and when there's shortages, prices go up, and you end up having huge lines for the gas station. Look, all these people waiting in line to get up to the gas station to buy gasoline. Also, think of all the ways that gasoline impacts prices other than cars. So trucking companies who are taking products, that's going to raise products of everything, because everything is going to cost more to ship. Heating your homes with gas is going to get more expensive. So the American economy is not doing great in the 1970s. Don't forget stagflation. So in 1976, we get a new president. President Jimmy Carter runs against President Ford. Republicans just have too many issues because of the Watergate scandal and the pardoning of Nixon by Ford. And Carter comes in. Carter is clean. He's got no skeletons in the closet. He's highly moral, seen as just a stand-up guy that's going to come in and clean up the corruption issues of Washington, D.C. But he comes into a mess. He comes into an economic mess. There's inflation of 10%. Interest rates are at 20%. People don't have jobs. And so he's going to spend a lot of his time dealing with the economy. And he's not going to be able to pull the country out. So what is Carter dealing with? So obviously he's dealing with the economy. The energy crisis, not enough oil, gasoline's high prices, and not enough of it. And so he creates a new department, a new cabinet level department called the Department of Energy in order to try to tackle some of these problems. He tries to bring some people together to try to solve these issues. Another domestic issue that happens is a explosion at 3 Mile Island, a nuclear power plant, a nuclear reactor that had a partial meltdown. And so obviously this is going to spew toxins and nuclear waste into the environment. It's going to be a big deal. And so in order to keep these things from occurring in the future, he creates the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to try to develop strict standards on nuclear energy. The other issue that Carter's going to be dealing with is something known as redlining. Now, redlining would be a bank gets a map of the city where they lend, and they outline certain areas where they are not going to lend people money to buy homes. Usually these were low-income neighborhoods, and these lines would be drawn, and it would cause these neighborhoods to basically just continue to get worse and worse. People can't get loans to fix up their houses. They can't get loans to move in. And Carter created a law. Well, he got Congress to pass a law that he signed, known as the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977, which is going to force the banks to lend in these lower income areas and not discriminate against different areas because of the economic status that area has.